Analysis Summit Southern Africa will be hosted in Durban. The 12th edition of the conference will see the best minds in business analysis, both locally and internationally, descend on the sunny shores between the 4th and the 6th of November. This is a developing story, so keep your eye out for further information. Make sure you don't miss out on the business analysis event of the year.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first Tools and Techniques session of May 2024. And a special welcome to our guest speaker, Chris Dutton, all the way from the USA. For any newcomers, the TNT sessions are hosted by the IIBA SA chapter, and it's arranged by a team of volunteers, just as a by-the-by. Our topic tonight is From Data to Decisions, using data visualization to transform information into insights. Before I introduce Chris, some rules and other bits. Please stay muted unless clear to talk. Keep your videos also switched off and only the presenters allowed. Presentation will be about 45 minutes long, so we'll be planning for about 15 minutes of Q&A. Post your questions in the Q&A, or you're welcome to make comments in the chat. There's various websites. You are welcome to take a screenshot, links, but we will post them again in the chat. Now for the most important bit. Chris is an EdTech entrepreneur and best-selling instructor. As founder and head of product at Maven Analytics, he has been featured by the USA Today, Business Insider, and the New York Times, helping 1 million+ students build new skills, showcase their work, and connect with peers and employers around the world. Well, the saying goes, facts tell, stories sell. So Chris, we look forward to learning from you tonight.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the intro and for the opportunity to speak with you all. This is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. What I love about data visualization is that it's really this rare opportunity to flex the left brain and right brain thinking. Typically in the analytics world, we do a lot of kind of logical, quantitative work, that left brain work. Data visualization and storytelling is an opportunity for us to think creatively and put our artistic skills to use. So I absolutely love it. I think it's my favorite part of the job. And what I want to share with you today are some tips and best practices and frameworks that you can apply to your everyday work to help you communicate more effectively with data. So with that, let me go ahead and share my screen. And I actually want to start with a quick question. If you can just drop a chat and let me know, what is your favorite go-to chart type? There's no right or wrong answers. I always love to ask this question and curious to see what people come up with. So go ahead and drop a note in the chat and let me know what chart types you like to use. And I'll go ahead and share my screen here. All right, you see my screen okay?
Perfect.
Excellent. So why don't we start with some definitions here about data visualization and storytelling. So data visualization, by definition, is the graphical representation of data or information. Or as I like to say, it's about bringing your data to life. And it's important to keep in mind that as humans, our human brain isn't optimized to interpret numbers and tables and raw data points. We need patterns, we need visual cues, things that help us quickly make sense of complex information. And that's exactly what makes data visualization such an effective communication tool. Now, in this presentation, we'll also talk a little bit about data storytelling as well. which is basically an extension of data visualization that's a bit more focused on crafting narratives designed to communicate insight, to influence decisions, or to support very specific data-driven recommendations. So what better way to explain these concepts than by visualizing them? So here's a table of raw data. It's US music industry revenue broken down by physical and digital formats and trended by year. It's not super complicated. There's not a ton of information there, but it still definitely takes some time to look in, dig into this, and interpret what's actually going on. So here's that same data set visualized using a stacked column chart. And this makes it very easy to see both the overall revenue trend as well as that shifting composition between physical and digital formats. And if we take it one step further, here's that same data set presented with a story. So we can see that digital revenue climbed steadily since the iTunes launch in 2003, but overall industry revenue is down 50% compared to the peak in 1999. So in this case, we're using tools like text, like data labels, like visual callouts to really try to deliberately focus the reader's attention on a very specific narrative rather than having them draw their own conclusions. And so this can be a really, really powerful tool when done well, especially when it comes to conducting explanatory analysis or presenting insights and recommendations to your stakeholders. So one of my favorite ways to demonstrate the power of data visualization is something called the 10-second rule. So what I'm going to do is show you a table of data on the screen, and then I'm going to start a 10-second timer. And in those 10 seconds, your task will be to try to gather as much meaningful information about this data as you possibly can. Ready? Let's give it a shot. All right, so that's time's up. Turns out 10 seconds goes by pretty quick, right? When you're looking at a table of data like that. And during that time, what information were you able to actually gather, right? Probably not much. Maybe you noticed that we were looking at 4 different products or that we're tracking sales by month. Maybe you started to see some high-level trends or patterns in the data, but realistically, it's pretty much impossible to process and understand that much tabular data in such a short time span. So now we're going to try again, except this time I'm going to present that same data set visually. Okay, 3, 2, 1, go. All right, so how did it feel that time? Hopefully you were able to gather much more information more quickly, right? When you visualize this data set, the patterns and trends start to emerge much, much more quickly. We can see that product A, for instance, was steadily growing and then saw a big dip in month 6. Product B follows kind of a logistic curve and has flattened out in the past 2 or 3 months. Product C saw a huge spike in month 11, and it looks like product D follows some sort of a quarterly seasonal pattern. And in case you're curious, this is a variation of something called Anscombe's quartet, which shows us that even though these 4 series have very, very similar descriptive statistics, they each tell very different and distinct stories when you visualize them. So that's the 10-second rule. Now I want to talk about a really important framework that we teach all the time called the 3 key questions. And this comes into play when you're deciding how to visualize a data set or which specific chart to use. So question 1, what type of data are you working with? Is it geospatial data? Is it time series data, categorical, hierarchical, or is it something more specialized like financial data, survey responses, funnel stages, things like that? The second key question is what exactly are you trying to communicate? Are you showing a comparison, a composition, a relationship, a distribution? Depending on what you're actually trying to show or the story you're trying to tell, there are different chart types that are optimized for those purposes. And finally, question 3, arguably the most important of all, who is the audience? Who are you speaking to? And what do they need? Are you sharing this visual with a fellow analyst, with a manager, an executive, general public? How you answer these questions will really help you determine which type of chart or visual is most appropriate given the context. So at this point, I want to kind of unpack each of these in a little bit more detail. So question one, what type of data are you working with? As we all know, there are many different flavors of data out there. Got common types of data like time series, right? Values changing over time, geospatial, categorical, and hierarchical. But you might come across some more unique and specialized types of data as well. So things like financial statements, text data, funnel stages, survey responses, and more. And really the key takeaway here is that the type of data you're working with often helps determine which type of visual will best represent it. So common examples include using maps for geospatial analysis, right? Using line charts for time series, bar or column charts for categorical comparisons. And then when you have more specialized cases, you might use something like a waterfall chart to track financial balances, or a Likert scale to summarize survey responses, things like that. So question two, again, is about understanding what you want to communicate. And there's really 4 buckets of communication when it comes to data visualization: comparisons, compositions, distributions, and relationships. So I'll kind of take a look at each of these in turn, starting with comparisons. So comparison visuals, as the name suggests, are used to compare values either over time or across different categories. So the common visuals that you'll see here are variations of bar and column charts, along with line or area charts if you're dealing with time series data. Also, some less common examples might be a funnel chart if you want to show sequential stages, like for instance, the number of applicants who make it through each round of an interview or hiring process, for example. Composition visuals are used to break down the component parts of a whole. So this is where you'll often use stacked bar or column charts, pie or donut charts, stacked areas for showing both composition and time series, or maybe some specialized charts like tree maps or sunbursts, which are much less common. Next, we have our distribution visuals. This is useful when you want to show the frequency of values within a series. By far, the most common and effective visual for distributions is a histogram, but there are some other ways to visualize distributions as well. Got box and whisker charts, density plots, heat maps, things like that. And then last but not least, relationship visuals help you show correlation between multiple variables. And this is typically done using scatter plots or variations like bubble charts, but you might use something like a heat map or a correlation matrix here as well. Now, I want to pause here and make a really, really important point, which is that you might be feeling a little bit lost or a little bit overwhelmed given just how many types of visuals and charts are out there. But I want to give you some peace of mind. 90% of the time, basic variations of bar, column, and line charts will be the simplest and clearest way to visualize your data. So it's really important, if you start to get stressed or overwhelmed, keep it simple and avoid using complex or custom visuals unless you absolutely need to, or unless the data specifically calls for it. And really the key here is to make sure you're prioritizing simplicity and clarity over aesthetics and design. That's one of the most common mistakes that we see. We run global data challenges every month where we provide a data set and a brief, and we ask people to build reports or dashboards as part of this kind of global competition. And one of the most common mistakes we see people make is using these really fancy or really complex visuals that are beautiful. They look amazing on paper. Like I'd want to print it out and put it up on my wall as a poster. But as an analyst, they're very, very hard to interpret, and they don't do a great job clearly communicating the message at hand. So again, prioritize simplicity and clarity over aesthetics and design. So that brings us to question 3. Who is the audience and what do they need? And let's consider 3 cases here, right? The analyst, the manager, and the C-level executive. Another one of the most common mistakes that we see is that people tend to design based on what they want to build, not what their audience needs to see. So designing effective visuals really requires a level of empathy, right? An understanding of who your audience is and exactly what they're looking for. So these are a few examples that we'll talk through here. The analyst, for instance, tends to be someone who wants detail, right? They're comfortable with data. They tend to work with numbers. So they like to understand what's happening at a granular level. In that case, they're likely to respond pretty well to things like data tables or combo charts with enough detail that they can use to support root cause analysis or really dig in on their own. Moving kind of up the chain a little bit, the manager is someone who typically wants more summarized data that leads to clear insights that will help them operate the business and do their job effectively. So for a manager audience, it's typically best to stick with common charts and graphs. Again, those bar charts, line charts, column charts, and only enough detail to support specific insights and recommendations, because that's what matters most to that audience. And then finally, the executive needs that high level, crystal clear business KPIs just to track business health and top line performance. Things like KPI cards or very simple charts with minimal detail, unless it really adds critical context to those metrics. So bottom line here is that how you choose to visualize and present the data is very much a function of who will be consuming it. So again, analysts or data specialists might want to see that granular detail or those complex charts, while managers or execs often prefer high-level metrics with a focus on clear data-driven insight. So at this point, I want to take a minute to talk about what I would consider some of the most essential visuals. These are going to be the charts and graphs that I personally use 99% of the time as a data professional. So I'd encourage you to focus on these as well, especially if you're relatively new to the field. So many of these should look pretty familiar, right? We've got bar and column charts for categorical comparisons, got line charts for time series, stacked bars or donut charts for composition. Area charts are a great way for showing compositional changes over time. Of course, we've got things like filled maps for geoanalysis, scatter plots for relationships, and then honestly, sometimes nothing beats a simple table or matrix, maybe with some conditional formatting to create a heat map effect like we see here in the lower right corner. So go ahead, print this out. We're going to make the deck available for you to take home and throw it up on your fridge, on the wall of your cube, wherever you need it. And hopefully it will serve as a helpful cheat sheet the next time you need some help figuring out which chart type to use. All right, so up to this point, we've really been focusing on data visualization best practices, but sometimes it can be really helpful to look at worst practices too. So I want to take a minute and talk about some more of these really common visualization mistakes that we tend to see, and also how I might recommend fixing them. So first up, very common problem, using the wrong chart type. So this is a super common mistake. We often see people doing things like using line charts to show categorical comparisons, or tree maps when a simple bar chart would be ideal. Here we're using a pie or a donut chart to show quarterly data, which technically isn't incorrect, but assuming we're interested in understanding that quarterly trend over time, a column or a line chart like this one would show that trend much, much more clearly. Next up, we've got lack of focus, right? And here we've got a line chart with a ton of different series plotted to the point where it just looks like spaghetti. And this technically is the correct type of visual given the data we're looking at. We're looking at trending over time using line charts, but it doesn't communicate any clear pattern or purpose whatsoever. So in cases like these, it can be helpful to either remove series that don't actually contribute to the analysis or the story, or use selective color like this to draw attention to the lines or specific data points that matter most to your audience. Then we have noise and distractions, right? This is stuff like 3D formats, animations, background images, and so on. And the simple mantra to remember with this one is that if it doesn't add value, it doesn't belong in the visual. So in this case, we've got a pretty horrendous 3D pie chart that pulls out all the stops, right? All the worst practices. We've got 3D effects, it's distorted, we've got beveled edges, exploding segments. It's like all the things I would recommend not doing with a visual are captured here. So in this case, I think sticking with a simple donut chart like this would do just fine. So we've gotten rid of all those extra bells and whistles that really don't add any value. They just distract the audience. Next up, again, pretty common one that I talked about is prioritizing aesthetics or form over function and clarity. And that essentially just means picking charts based on what would look cool on a poster, as opposed to what communicates the information most clearly. So in this case, we've got a sunburst chart that shows employees by team and by office location. And it looks pretty sweet, right? It would look nice on a dashboard, but it's actually kind of tough to interpret when you look closer. So for something like this, you might not even choose to visualize that data at all if something like a simple table like this one provides the exact information that you need. Now, here's a devious one, right? The misleading narrative, which is about exaggerating trends or patterns to make them appear more dramatic or significant than they actually are. So take a look at this column chart. We're comparing some sort of results between men and women. And clearly this data skews very heavily towards the male side, right? Well, actually, no. If you look closer at the y-axis, it's been truncated so much that it makes fractions of percentages look massive. So when we reset that y-axis to start at 0, we see the real story here, which is that there's really not much of a significant difference between genders at all. And then last but not least, missing context. So in this case, we have a dual axis chart with a line and a column, but it's impossible to tell what's what. There's no chart title, there's no legend, no axis labels to help us match each series to the correct values. So the obvious fix here is to simply add those chart elements like so to make sure the readers can follow along. So those are some of the most common visualization mistakes that we tend to see and some potential solutions to fix them. Next up, let's talk about context. And context is really important. Whenever you're presenting or visualizing data, remember that context is what actually gives the numbers meaning. It's what helps your end users interpret them accurately instead of jumping to their own conclusions. So close your eyes for a minute. Imagine that you're a manager and one of your analysts on your team comes by your desk and hands you this and says, hey, we had 690 transactions in October. So how do you respond to that, right? This is just a data point, which in isolation, it means very little. And to interpret what this number actually means and how we should respond to it, we have to understand context. We need to understand things like how that number has changed over time. You know, is it going up? Is it going down? Is 690 good? Is it bad? Is it above or below our projections? All of those things are context that would help us understand how to interpret and respond to this number. So now consider this version of the report. Right here, we're showing that same KPI value, but now we're also adding reference labels to compare against last month, last year, and against the forecast or the target. We've added line charts to show the trend over time. We can draw attention to high and low points. using this kind of creative formatting here. And we're just packing so much more context into this view. And by doing that, now we can draw many, many more meaningful conclusions, right? So we know there were 690 transactions in October, but now we also know that that's down 4% compared to last month, but still up 9% year over year. We know that we exceeded our target in September and October after we fell short in August. We know that we're seeing an upward trend throughout the year with a big peak in July. And we also know, because we're comparing against last year's performance, that based on seasonality, we can expect a pretty strong November, December. So key takeaway here, remember that anytime you share data, it's really important to think about how you can add context like this to make it meaningful. All right, so up to this point, we've been talking about data visualization strictly in terms of individual charts and visuals. So now it's time to broaden the scope a little bit and talk about data storytelling and dashboard design. And for anyone interested, this is a topic that we do cover in quite a bit more depth in some of our courses at Maven Analytics, specifically our Thinking Like an Analyst course, if anyone wants to go deeper. There are also entire books written on this subject, but I want to take a minute to kind of touch on this at a high level here, just because it's such an important aspect of communicating with data. So data stories are often told through things like ad hoc reports or explanatory dashboards. So by explanatory dashboard, I mean a report or dashboard that's trying to tell or communicate a very specific story. And you'll often see examples that look like this. This is an explanatory visual, or you might have reports and dashboards that look like that. Now, dashboards, kind of by definition, are tools designed to consolidate data from multiple sources, to track key metrics, and most importantly, to facilitate data-driven decision-making, because making smart data-driven decisions is ultimately the most important thing that we do as data professionals. Now, when we teach data storytelling and dashboard design skills, we often walk through a 6-step process or framework. And we'll kind of touch on this at a high level here, but again, if you want to go deeper, we can point you to some resources that really unpack these in quite a bit more depth. So it all starts with defining the purpose. We have a similar framework for analytical thinking, but this involves questions like, who's the audience? What are their goals? What specific questions do they need answers to? Why am I building this dashboard or report, right? Step 2, once you've defined the purpose, is to choose the right metrics. This is about making sure that the data you present directly aligns with those business goals and that the level of detail is appropriate for your audience. Step 3 is presenting the data effectively. This is about selecting the right types of charts and graphs and visuals for the job. Step 4, which we've talked about quite a bit, is to eliminate clutter and noise. Again, those things like 3D formats, excessive colors, background images, grid lines, anything that takes up space but doesn't add value or contribute to the story. And one of my favorite all-time quotes, which I think applies quite well here, is perfection is achieved not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. And I think that's a really well put quote, some great words of wisdom, especially when you think about it in the context of dashboard design. So in other words, less is more. Step 5 is about using layout to focus attention. And this can involve using things like Gestalt design principles, like proximity and enclosure, to group related elements on the page. It involves using attributes like size and color to draw attention to specific patterns or data points, and leveraging common reading patterns like Z patterns or F patterns, which we'll talk about in a bit, to create a logical flow and make sure your audience sees the most important information first. And then last but not least, step 6 is about telling a clear story. This is where a little bit of text can go a long way, and where things like using descriptive chart titles and data labels can really help you craft an effective narrative. So that's our design framework. Next up, I'll run through a quick end-to-end example so that you can get a sense of what this actually looks like in action. So we're going to basically do a little role playing here and work through a hypothetical case study on data storytelling. So here's the situation. I want you to pretend that you just got hired as a BI analyst for a company called Maven Toys. Not a real toy store, obviously. This is a fictional example, but consider that it's a nationwide chain of toy stores, right? Your assignment is to design an explanatory dashboard for the regional sales managers to help them understand how their regions are performing. They're going to review that dashboard monthly, and they need information on things like revenue trends, product level performance, and lost revenue due to inventory shortages. And our objectives here, basically, we're going to work through that 6-step framework and see how the product evolves step by step. We're going to define the purpose. We're going to talk about how to choose the right metrics, how to present the data effectively. I'll show you some tips for eliminating clutter and noise, using layout to focus attention, and then finally we'll package it into a clear story to take it to the finish line. All right, so step 1, defining the purpose. These are the types of questions that you're typically asking yourself at this phase, right? Who's your audience? What are their business goals and objectives? What questions do they need answers to? How often will it be reviewed? And luckily, we have all this information in our project brief. In the real world, you'll likely be gathering this information through actual conversations with your managers or with the stakeholders themselves. So who's the audience? It's the regional sales managers. What are their goals and objectives? They want to increase revenue. They want to minimize revenue loss due to lack of inventory. What questions might they need answers to with this report? Well, they want to understand how their revenue is trending. They want to understand which products are performing best and worst, individual products and categories. They want to understand if there are products out of stock that's costing them revenue. And then how often will it be reviewed? Monthly, once a month. So step 1, complete. We've defined the purpose of our dashboard. So now that we have a clear picture of the business goals, we can start thinking about which specific metrics to include and at what level of granularity is going to make the most sense for our audience. So a little pro tip here, creating a table like this one to map these metrics against each of our business goals can be a really fantastic way to document your thought process. You might even add things like metric definitions here as well to build a data dictionary. This is a really smart thing to do, especially if you're working with complex or industry-specific metrics, or if you're building a report or dashboard that's going to be shared throughout the organization. Having an asset or a piece of collateral like this to document what you've built and why is a really, really nice touch. And it's a step that a lot of analysts skip. A lot of people kind of jump straight to building and visualizing and assembling the dashboard. But walking through this process first is really, really critical to create the highest quality end product that you can. So for the business goal of increasing revenue, some metrics we might want to include here are things like total revenue, right? By month, by region, by category, by store and product, as well as month over month and year over year comparisons to add some meaningful context. And for the goal of minimizing loss from lack of inventory, we'd want to be able to track things like what's the product stock on hand at the store and the product level, and maybe estimate the monthly revenue loss based on what we would have expected those products had to sell had they been in stock. Now, keep in mind, this is really just a demonstration. This isn't a black and white exercise, and it's not something that you should expect to get right or get perfect on the first pass. In reality, this would take a lot of time and thought to put together, and you'll likely iterate and evolve this list as you start designing the dashboard. So it ends up being kind of a circular iterative process. So I know I'm making it sound very simple and straightforward here, but in reality, this is tough, but it's well worth the effort. So we're on to step 3, right? Presenting the data effectively. And here's where you take all that information from step 2, right? All the metrics that you've landed on, the level of detail. And now you start to think about what's the best way to visually represent those metrics, right? So we're going back to those 3 key questions. We're thinking about, are we showing compositions? Are we showing trends? And using that logic to decide what visual types are going to make the most sense. So for revenue by month, we'll probably use a line chart there. For revenue by region, which is probably the single most important number that these regional managers care about, probably want to really draw attention to that number with something like a KPI card to really give it the emphasis it deserves. Revenue by category, that's categorical, right? So maybe a bar chart there. And for the product level details, we might choose a table, right? So that we can include some additional details like the product name, the category, stock on hand, etc. And if we continue this process, we'll end up with something kind of like this. And note that these are all very simple visuals, right? We've got lines, bars, KPI cards, and tables. Nothing custom, nothing really complex here, but this should really get the job done given our metrics and the business goals that we care about. So again, this is another step, another case where you'll very likely iterate multiple times before you land on, the final version. So don't stress too much about getting this right on the first pass. Okay, so let's see what it might look like if we took all those visuals from the last step and we just dumped them onto our report canvas. Well, we'd end up with something that looks like this, okay? And technically, we've checked all the boxes so far. We've defined a clear purpose. We've chosen the right metrics and the most effective chart types, but obviously our work isn't done, right? This is cluttered. It's noisy. There's no intuitive layout or flow here. So it's time to leverage some of those visualization and storytelling best practices that we talked about, starting with eliminating clutter and noise. So there are a lot of simple things that we can do here that will go a long way in terms of improving simplicity and polish. So first up, look at that revenue line chart right in the middle of the dashboard. We could update that to simplify the axis and the data labels. We could remove the grid lines and the borders, which are just noisy. And we could change the colors to draw more attention to the current year, which might look something like this. We could apply similar changes to the product category bar charts beneath that chart as well. And maybe we use color a little bit more strategically to draw attention to positive or negative trends, like so. And one tip here, if you want to make it more colorblind friendly, you might use colors like blue and orange rather than red and green like we're showing here. And then finally, we've got those product tables on the right side of the dashboard. For those, maybe we kill the borders, we could adjust the text alignment, clean things up a little bit, and maybe add some conditional formatting to really focus on which products are driving the gains and losses each month. So something like this. So that's feeling much better already, even with just a handful of relatively simple tweaks to get rid of that extra clutter and noise. And that takes us to step 5, right? So using layout to focus attention. At this point, we want to think about how to actually assemble these visuals into the most intuitive possible layout that's going to help us create a narrative and focus the viewer's attention on the right places. So in most Western cultures, viewers typically start at the top left of the page up here. Then they scan to the right, then make their way down the page from left to right, following either a Z pattern, like you see here, or sometimes an F pattern, which looks more like this. Either way, the point is to feature the most important high-level information towards that top left portion of your canvas. So with that in mind, one thing that we might tweak here in this case is rearranging that report header at the top to put the report title in that top left and bump the logo, which is less important, to that top right corner of the page. And now for the rest of our visuals, let's kind of clear the deck, let's clear the canvas, and start to reassemble them in a way that's a little bit more strategic and deliberate. So we're going to see if we can improve the layout and flow here, and also practice applying some of these design principles to make sure that we're drawing the eye to the numbers and the charts that matter most. So remember all the way back to the brief. One of the most important business objectives was understanding revenue trending and revenue growth. So it would make sense to put our revenue KPI cards and our revenue trending chart in that prime real estate on the left side of the canvas, like so. Note that we are also kind of playing with font size here. We're using color strategically to emphasize that current month revenue total and de-emphasize the month over month and year over year figures using smaller font sizes. And one thing to note here is we're also using a subtle design principle known as enclosure. You see that kind of shape, that rectangle that seems to be grouping these visuals and values together? We're doing that deliberately because these are all part of the same revenue story. And we want users to understand that these charts and numbers kind of belong together in a group before they shift their attention away to other parts of the dashboard. Then another best practice when it comes to dashboard design and layout is to start at a high level and then progressively get more granular as the viewer moves through the dashboard. So with that in mind, I think maybe what we could do is pull in our category level bar charts next, like so. And if you look closely, you'll notice we've actually removed the axis labels from the revenue change chart, that green and red chart, and aligned the two visuals to create something called continuity between them. That's another example of a Gestalt design principle that we're putting to use here. Again, just another way to simplify and clarify the story that we're telling. So now we've got the product category level data. Let's get more granular and drill down to the product level. So now we're talking about our top 5 and our bottom 5 product tables. Got that nice conditional formatting to draw attention to the revenue drivers and revenue losses. And now because everything we've shown so far has been revenue focused, what I want to do is create a little separation and make it very clear that the stock and inventory related data, like so, it's kind of telling its own distinct story, right? So we could do something like this. We could add some enclosure around that table of products with no stock and pull in the KPI card, that $1,640 value, to really emphasize the potential revenue loss, since that directly ties to our second key business objective. So when you compare that to the last, or the first iteration of just dumping the charts on the page, hopefully you're starting to see that now there's a really logical flow, and we're helping guide the viewer's eye to the right places at the right times. And then finally, we're looking really good, but we're on to step 6, the final step, which is telling a story. And one of the simplest, most effective ways to do this is just by replacing those default chart titles, total revenue, product level revenue, products with no stock, with meaningful descriptive text. We can also use font colors and styles to help users quickly interpret what they're looking at. So take a look at what it looks like right now. And then if we were to change those titles to make them more descriptive and tell a story, it might look something like this. So now it almost like reads like a story, right? How did this region perform in September 2021? This is how much revenue we generated, right? We're using that bold blue font tied directly to the bold blue KPI. It's so clear, it's so easy to follow, and it's such a great way to help your end users and stakeholders cut to the chase and get the exact information that they need. So final step would be to tie it all up with maybe some specific insights and recommendations. Maybe you want to launch some product offerings similar to Playfoam, which is a top revenue driver. But hopefully this was a helpful demonstration of data storytelling in action and a great example of what that dashboard design process can look like from start to finish. So that wraps up all the kind of key content here. I want to just close it off by recapping some key takeaways. First off, data visualization, again, is the graphical representation of data and information. In other words, it's what brings data to life. It's what helps us quickly make sense of complex information. Data storytelling takes it one step further. It's about creating narratives to communicate insights, influence decisions, and support specific data-driven recommendations. And then remember, whenever you choose a visual, make sure to consider those three key questions: what data you're working with, what you want to communicate, and who is your audience and what do they need. Answering those questions will help you determine the most effective type of visual to use given the context. Then we talked about some common mistakes like choosing the wrong chart type, failing to focus, adding clutter and noise, or prioritizing form over function. And finally, remember that context is key. So context is what gives numbers meaning, and it's what helps your users interpret them accurately. So one kind of last note here before I stop sharing my screen is if anyone wants to dig a little bit deeper and strengthen their skills, highly recommend checking out the resources we have at mavenanalytics.io. We've got self-paced courses, personalized learning plans based on the skills you're trying to build, free practice data sets, guided projects, a completely free portfolio builder for you to showcase your work, got skills assessments, and live expert coaching and support. And if you want to check out the website, here's the URL. If you'd like to follow me on LinkedIn, here's a link to my LinkedIn profile as well, or you can scan that QR code. And final note, we don't run sales very often, but we actually are in the middle of one of our biggest sales of the year. So if you do want an all-access subscription to the platform, you can get up to 40% off our pro plans if you sign up in the next week. So I believe Liana or someone from the team will drop a link in the chat, or you can follow up and connect with me, and I'd be happy to provide any information that you need. So with that, I will stop sharing, and that wraps up our presentation.
If you want to still share, Chris, maybe you can leave it on this screen with your contact details, to your LinkedIn and
Sure.
things in case people didn't have time to do it. But thank you so much for this. It was so informative and so practical in how we actually get to that visualization stage. You're so eager to want to draw up your graphs and, have your dashboard, but a lot of those thought processes get skipped in along the way. So we've got some questions here, and some of them I'm just going to group together, right? In terms of the aesthetics of it, like choice of color, are there any special rules, and what is the norm around that? And then how easy is it to change between the different types of charts in the dashboard and to clean that clutter in the visual charts?
Yeah, so let's start by talking about color. There are two considerations, right? One is using color deliberately to focus attention, and there are a few ways to do it. The example we showed, tying color, between the chart titles and the actual data points and series in the charts is a really nice tip just to help people really quickly identify, okay, I'm looking at the blue chart, that's revenue, and that's consistent everywhere in my dashboard. So it can be a really helpful tool to focus attention. One thing a lot of people do, which is understandable, is they just kind of stick with the default colors when you insert a chart in Power BI or Excel or whatever it might be. And you have all different color charts all over. It looks like a rainbow, which might be beautiful to look at, but I often like to really scale back the color choices and almost start with like grayscale and then use color to make very specific data series or data points pop. And when everything else is kind of consistent and subtle, and then you see that pop of color, again, that's a really great way to point people's attention to the stories that you're trying to tell or the insights that matter most. The other consideration with color, which I alluded to earlier, is just being conscious of accessibility and being colorblind friendly. So there are some really great tools online that will basically allow you to like import some colors and see what it looks like through the eyes of someone who's colorblind. And the biggest risk is using reds and greens, which tend to look very similar for people with color blindness. And so that's why I mentioned there's a common trend these days of using blues and oranges, which are easier to distinguish for anyone. So I think those are some notes on how I would suggest using color in a thoughtful way.
No, and then just another one is how important is the tool versus the data analysis? And what tools or software do you recommend for data visualization?
I love that question. The tools don't matter much at all. I think it's the foundational skills that really, really make a difference. You can pick up tools, you can learn different ones. The tool is just how you apply your skills, right? And if you can build a clear and effective report in Excel or Power BI or Tableau or Click or whatever it might be, your stakeholder is not going to care what vehicle you use to produce that visual. They're going to care about whether or not you used best practices, you created a visual that's clear and compelling, and that you've tied it to an insight and a recommendation. So I would definitely focus on building skills first, and then figuring out which tools you can use to apply those skills. Personally, I started my career going really deep in Excel and SQL as a data analyst, and then I eventually picked up Power BI when we started building reports that we had to kind of share throughout the broader organization. So that's kind of my sweet spot right now. I would say like Excel and Power BI are the two tools that I'm using most frequently. But again, Tableau is fantastic too. You know, a lot of people really swear by Tableau for data visualization as well.
Okay. So another, I'm going to accommodate a combination here again. What are some of the latest trends or innovations in data visualization, and how do you stay updated on them? And then one of the buzzwords at the moment. So what is the role of AI that AI is playing in data storytelling, and what role could it play?
Yeah, I figured we'd talk about AI at some point. So the first part of the question, right? Like what's like new and novel and what's changed? You know, honestly, a lot of like the core principles and the core best practices have not changed much. You know, the basic, highly effective chart types that we talked about, bar charts, column charts, line charts, there's a reason those have been used for decades, because they are simple and they're clear, and in many cases, they are the best tools to tell a story. That said, in terms of like modern stuff, I think a lot of tools are making it easier and easier for users to customize and fine-tune visuals to serve the exact purpose that they're looking to. In fact, I don't know if there are any Tableau fans in the audience, but they just announced at the Tableau conference last week this concept of visual extensions, which are kind of custom charts that they're pulling into Tableau Public and Tableau Desktop. And they're actually exposing the source code for those visuals so that you can actually use programming languages to tweak every possible feature or pixel of those charts. So the customization options are becoming pretty impressive. The other kind of broader theme in the last, I'd say 5 to 10 years is just the evolution of self-service, low-code tools like Power BI, for instance, that make it pretty easy and pretty accessible for everyday people to build pretty impressive, complex, dynamic reports and dashboards without necessarily requiring a really heavy technical skill set or background. Onto AI. So our stance on AI, and we've thought about this a lot. We teach a ChatGPT course. We have some course content that talks about the history of AI and large language models and GPTs and all that. Our stance is that AI is a tool. It's not a replacement for foundational skills, but it's a supplement for your skills. And the people who are going to succeed in the age of AI are the people who have that strong foundational technical baseline enhanced by AI. And the people who really over-index on those uniquely human skills like creativity, empathy, intuition, context, those are the people who are going to thrive because now they're using AI as almost like an accelerator. I think the risk is when people look at AI and think of it like a silver bullet or a replacement for the foundational skills. Because I've played with these tools a lot, and there are some pretty major pitfalls if you don't know what to look for, if you don't have that foundation or that core skill set. If you're blindly trusting whatever AI gives back to you, you're in for a rude awakening because AI is not perfect. It makes mistakes, and without that kind of foundational understanding, it can be very tough to catch. That said, I'm a huge fan of AI. I think it's a tool that should be in every data professional's toolkit. I use ChatGPT all the time. I'm just starting to play with Copilot and Gemini now, but yeah, that's my 2 cents on the topic.
Thank you so much, Chris. And this has been, as I said, really, really informative. It's very practical, and it's very easy to understand and adapt it as well. So thank you so much for sharing your skills and knowledge and answering all our questions around this.
Great, very welcome.
There's a lot of good compliments in the chat as well. Even people that are not dating enthusiasts are enjoying all these, the microclass, and they thank you for it. They say it's a brilliant presentation, and thanks so much to the team. Thanks, Chris. Very well presented and very informative. Well presented, excellent. Chris. Thank you so much for a great practical session. We've just got 2 minutes to go, so I just want to add a few things just for those that are on the course. Just to remember that our next tools and techniques will be on the 23rd of May, and it's a business process modeling tools and technique with Etienne Fenter. So please make sure you register and, to attend that. And then just coming up in the near future, we have the BA Summit that's scheduled for later in this year. So please watch the space for that. We have our tools and techniques every alternate Thursday at the same time, 7 p.m. And we have lean coffee sessions every Wednesday morning at 8 a.m. So that's very good to attend. You can bring all your questions where you're stuck, and there's lots of like-minded people in there that'll help you to answer your questions or get you thinking about new things. So if you're curious about the BA forum or anything associated with it, anything on the peripherals as well, please do join for that, because that is quite informative. So with that, I just want to say thanks once again, Chris. It was a pleasure to have you here, and I wish we had more time to spend digging into your brain and getting to the nitty-gritty of this. Liana,
it's great to be here. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And we're definitely not allowing you to not come back. You're definitely invited again. And it was absolutely great. A picture tells 1,000 stories, isn't it? Something along those lines. And I think you've definitely told us in the best of ways. You've shown us all the necessary pictures, and I still don't like scatter plots. Never mind what anybody says.
That's fair.
Anyway, thank you everybody so much, Chris. And yeah, unfortunately, we